Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what I hope will be a really engaging webinar on climate change and what we can do from an investment perspective to tackle it. Joining me today are three fantastic speakers. Paul Gilding, former Executive Director of Greenpeace International, a Fellow of Cambridge University's Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and an author of The Great Disruption, the thesis of which Paul delivered at a now famous TED conference in 2012. We're also joined by Ursula Finterswald, Group Head of Sustainability Management at LGT, and Ted Franks, Partner and Fund Manager of the Web Sustainability Fund, a fund that we hold in sustainability managed client portfolios at LGT Vestra. To kick off this webinar, we're going to start by using an interactive tool. If you're able to, using another mobile device, maybe your phone, can you go to the webpage Menti, that's METI.com, and that should be coming up on a slide on the deck in front of us, and enter the code on the slide in front of you. So if you go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and enter the code 2499914. Or you can scan this QR code as well. So that's menti.com on your phone. Once you've entered the code, if you enter in the box in front of you on that web page, a word or phrase on what climate change means to you. And we should have some words coming through. Yep, survival, interesting one there. Solutions, great. There's a lot of sort of environmental themes, specific outcomes of climate change, descriptions. Yeah, it's a very emotive topic for many of us. Hope, that's a very positive one there. Help, hope, life. Gosh, they're getting smaller and smaller, I can't read them. Science, urgency. I love that challenge is there in the middle. Sustainability challenges to our world, such as climate change, have really become mainstream topics of conversation for us as individuals, for corporate boardrooms, and over the course of this year, for policymakers all over the world. In fact, you're hard pushed to find a head of state or government who hasn't made climate change a strategic importance over the last 12 months. We believe that the presence of the pandemic has had a transformational impact on awareness about and interest in sustainability. There's now a famous quote from the CEO of Microsoft who said that his business saw 2 years worth of transformational adoption in the technological adoption in the space of the first 2 months of lockdown. We believe something similar has been seen in terms of attitudes towards sustainability over the course of this year. During this webinar, we'll hear from Paul Gilding, who will discuss from a macro perspective the issues surrounding climate change, economically, geographically, politically. We'll then hear from Ursula, who will outline what we have been doing at LGT at group level in our approach to the environment, and how we are specifically looking to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And then finally, we'll hear from Ted, who will talk about the investment opportunities that he sees in tackling, in Mark Carney's words, the greatest commercial opportunity of our time. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do send them through to us in the chat function, as we have allocated time at the end to share these questions with the speakers today. Paul, if you're ready to speak, over to you.
Great, thanks, Phoebe. Yeah, I might start with a response to some of those words from Menti, which really focused on the social, moral kind of imperative for us to change for the sake of the future. And I think that's the essence of my work over the last 20 years or so in the corporate sector, but really for 30 years plus in terms of climate change, is to get people to understand that this issue is not primarily anymore, certainly not in 2020, a responsibility issue, a moral issue. It is, of course, a responsibility and a moral issue, but the way change will occur is not going to be driven by, in my opinion, is not going to be driven by the sense of the duty to the future or a sense of social responsibility or a sense of ethics or the like. It's going to be driven by a major economic transformation. And that's not all about opportunity. It's all about the combination of what I would call Schumpeter's creative destruction, which is the great disruption of markets driven by climate change and the consequences of it for the economy. Now, this is a really kind of obvious issue. Carney's comment that Phoebe just quoted then is an example of that, where we talk about this great opportunity and this great economic driver of change. But because the issue has been so embedded in this issue of responsibility and ethics and morality, we're kind of stuck in that place. And we have this deep, I think very deep, disconnect between what we do every day in markets and what we do in business strategy versus what we think about as the moral imperative of our time. And that history, I think, needs to be broken down, because I think we're going to see a lot more change, a lot faster change, if we focus on the issue as an economic one. Now, let me just expand on those ideas a bit. So, first of all, let's really see that what we need to do is change most parts of the economy and most companies and how they operate. Now, how that has occurred historically is a combination of regulation, of course, and policy, but it's primarily driven by technology, consumer demand, and opportunity to drive change. Now, why have we not done that, given that there is clearly a massive opportunity in responding to climate change? And the answer is because there's a lot to lose for a lot of companies and a lot of investors in changing. So this is not like the good guys, bad guys, the evil fossil fuel companies versus the shining light in the hill of the solar companies. This is good old-fashioned economics and business strategy, which rewards those who have been resisting change by giving them returns for longer. And as a result, it is a logical business issue, if you like, to resist change. So why have the oil companies, the coal and gas companies invested so much money in slowing down change over such a long time? Because it made economic sense for them to do so. Now, we can argue the morality of that. That's not my argument today. My point is that made economic sense in the 80s when I started working on climate change, in the 90s, and possibly past 2000. It no longer makes any sense because the pace of change now in the market is so great that the market is going to overrun any outstanding resistance. And I would argue, and I'm happy to take questions on this later, I would argue that now the market is the single biggest driver of change in the climate change context, much more so than policy, much more so than a price on carbon, for example, because there is now so many billions and increasingly trillions of dollars being invested against the idea that we are going to change. And that's a really, really critical moment, because what that means is the world is going to wake up to the fact that the losers are going to lose and therefore should be devalued, and the winners are going to win and therefore should be upvalued in terms of the opportunity that they're facing. So I really can't overstate how significant that is in terms of it's not how most of us think about the issue still. I spent the last 20 odd years advising large companies on sustainability more broadly, including fossil fuel dominant companies like BHP in Australia, but DSM, the Netherlands, Unilever with Pullman, and now with Alan Jope, with DuPont and Ford Motor Company, with many companies over several decades on this issue. So I have I think a very good and deep understanding of what drives change and what doesn't drive change, and how those things change over time. And my central conclusion would be that in all that work is that the dominant mechanism for change in markets, and this will translate in climate as well as in the investment community, is that incumbents do not generally adapt, they generally fail and are replaced. So what that means is that for all the decades that many, including myself, have argued that the oil companies, the gas and coal companies should transition and become energy companies, is flawed, because the economic history suggests that's not what tends to happen. There are exceptions to that rule, but by and large, what we see is that incumbents are destroyed by markets and new companies take their place. So the economy stays strong, but old companies die and are replaced. And I don't mean that every single oil, coal and gas company will cease to exist, or that every car company will cease to exist and be replaced, but most of them will. And most of them will actually fail in their strategies and respond, despite all the positive ideas and the words that we hear today from many leading companies, including in the oil industry. Most of them are not suited to the change that we see coming. And let me close with my opening comments with a set of examples. And I think the dominant one, which I think is going to get into history as being the kind of iconic case in point, is the story of Tesla. Now, we can all argue about Tesla's valuation and the process around that, but the story of Tesla is not that one. The story of Tesla is that they went to the existing car companies and they had a great idea and they had opportunities in technology, a lot of capacity to disrupt, and they concluded that those existing incumbent car companies would not understand or be able to translate this opportunity adequately and quickly enough to be successful. Therefore, they went alone. Now, they went alone with incredible amounts of risk. We've all heard the stories of the number of times that Tesla almost failed, logically should have failed. And I think is the reason it's such a powerful example is because this was not actually that disruptive. This is not oil companies becoming solar companies. This is car companies changing the engine. Now, I'm being a little bit flippant there in terms of how big the change is, but it's not a very big disruption compared to what we're seeing in the energy sector. And yet the car companies, the auto industry could not get that opportunity, did not seize that opportunity. And the markets, with the wisdom of crowd intelligence, basically concluded that Tesla was more likely to succeed and more likely to succeed spectacularly so than the existing car companies would be able to transform. That makes, on the surface, no logical sense. You got GM producing 9 million cars a year. In 2014, I think it was, GM was producing 9 million cars a year, making $5 billion a year profit, had enormously powerful entry points to the market. Tesla had nothing. Didn't know how to produce cars, didn't know how to market cars, didn't have any experience in the area. And yet, even in 2014, Tesla was valued at more than half of GM. Quite irrational, but nevertheless real. Nevertheless was what the market was doing. And that, I think, is what we learn from history, is that markets basically understand that most old companies don't change and most big ideas are delivered by new companies. That is a very scary prospect for investors. It's a very scary prospect for incumbent companies, many of whom I work with, because this inherent cultural inability to change is, I think, going to define the transformation on climate change. And this is not about just the end of fossil fuels. It's about transformation of the food industry. It's about the end of animal livestock agriculture, most likely, inside the next decade or so. It is about the creation of many, many Teslas and the failure of many, many incumbent companies. And that's the story of climate change. That is what I think the evidence shows is likely to happen. And therefore, we shouldn't be quite so distracted by the process of governments and policy making and prices on carbon, even though I think that is incredibly important. It's not the main game. The main game, I think, is going to be the market's response to the inevitability of change and the market's embrace of the opportunity that Carney talks about in this massive transformation, and the market's recognition that there is going to be massive losses in value for historically very powerful and very strong companies. So as investors, as analysts, as people who think about this from an investment point of view, I would encourage you to think about this through a market lens, because that's where I think the evidence is where the action is going to be. Thank you, Phoebe. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. I mean, it's a huge amount to think about, and I think that's going to inspire some very interesting questions from our audience later on in the presentation. So I'll come back to you if that's okay once we've heard from Ursula and Ted. Turning to Ursula, you're head of sustainability management at LGT. Can you introduce your role at LGT and talk about why climate change is something that the finance industry needs to be concerned with?
Yeah, so I'm head group sustainability management at LGT since almost 10 years now. So started really at the time when I think sustainability has not yet been really a topic for the financial industry, but we see that, or we saw that change over the last, I would say, 5 years especially. So it's very interesting also to work in that field, because it seems that we're in the spotlight of the storm right now. And so why is climate change something that the finance industry should be concerned with? Is because I think Paul already said it quite rightly, that climate change is really a systemic risk, not only for the financial sector, but for humankind in general. So systemic risks, we would say, is risks that have the potential to destabilize the normal functioning of a system and really to lead to serious negative consequences for the economy. According to a study in the Nature, an estimated 1/3 of oil reserves and more than 80% of known coal reserves should remain unburned in order to meet the global temperature targets under the Paris Agreement. The finance industry, as investor and provider of capital, has great leverage to invest in capital sustainable and low carbon solutions of the real economy, and thus accompany the shift towards a climate friendly society. So I think a very important role to play.
And that idea of the unburnt reserves on balance sheets is a really interesting one, and one that's coming up more and more. I mean, even since the pandemic and over the course of the summer, you saw BP and Shell have to write off billions and billions of assets, and that's something that in the finance industry we're having to build into our expected return in companies. So what can wealth managers and private banks do to specifically tackle climate change within our operations, let's say? What's LGT doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so since banks, I mean, you mentioned it already, we don't produce any products. So the ecological footprint of our operations is still important, but it's relatively small compared to what we can do and to achieve in our investments or on our investment side. Nevertheless, it's really important to be credible that we also do something on our operation side and really to tackle it there as well. So at LGT, when we look at the operation side, we have a relatively large footprint with our business travels. This stems because we are a global private bank. And so our colleagues, our front staff, of course, is visiting their clients all over the world, and so they fly around a lot, but also other staff to really visit all the locations. But in our sustainability strategy 2025, which we launched in 2018, we have set concrete targets to commit to climate protection, because climate change and climate protection is really an important topic for us. And we want to reduce our CO2 emissions by 20% per full-time equivalent by 2025. We said per full-time equivalent because we still grow as a company, and hence we also see that our CO2 emissions still grow, not in the same way, but still we said it's important to see that we reduce our CO2 emissions by full-time equivalent. Also, we want to reduce our energy consumption and our paper consumption by 30%. Maybe it will be even a greater reduction with paper consumption, because I think we really start off now becoming much more digital. Also, I think maybe this was a positive outcome of the pandemic, because we saw what is possible, which we haven't seen before. What we have as an ambition, because it's not so easy to really purchase 100% renewable energy worldwide by 2025. And as a new ambition, we also committed to become net zero by 2030 on the operations side.
Yeah, and that's a very big statement, isn't it? And it's something that I know that you've been working towards for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
One question around what we've learned from the pandemic and changing in working practices. Do you feel that people will be traveling less and understand the power of using tools like Zoom, and potentially that we'll be able to reduce that business travel? Or do you think that things will just go back to as they were before?
This is a very interesting question, Phoebe. So we guess that in the beginning, people will start to travel again because people weren't able to do it. And I think that they really, our RMs, they really want to see their clients, which I understand. I think they should also go and visit their clients, because I think we're in the people's business, and I think the personal relationship is very important. But we also are sure, or we hope that we will see also in future much more kind of meetings, gathering online via Zoom, via other possibilities we have, virtual possibilities we have, maybe also virtual events, virtual meetings, also with organizations where you otherwise meet and fly around somewhere in the world. So we hope that we will see more of that. And I think that digitalization will step up even more, because we saw new things arising, new possibilities, new solutions arising in the pandemic. So we're very positive on that.
And climate change and carbon production is in the news all the time now. How long has LGT been considering this issue?
So our owner, the princely family of Liechtenstein, they think and act long term. So really in generations, we can say, because their family already exists since 900 years, and they saw good times and bad times themselves. So for them, it's really also a big topic, and we can really feel that also in our culture. And I think we can say that the topic sustainability in general, but of course climate change being one of the also more important topics, is really also anchored in I would say in the company itself now. So it has always been important for the family, but I also think for LGT. Nevertheless, I said in the beginning that I joined LGT almost 10 years ago. So we started off then to tackle the topic in a more systematic way. So doing it for about 10 years now, and really also started to gather the data on where we stand with our CO2 emissions, and really trying to reduce our CO2 emissions. And I think it was also a core topic for Prince Max, close to his heart, to do more in this regard. So we can see that, let's say, starting from 2005-06, when he joined LGT, we really started off with the topic.
Yeah, and that's quite far earlier than many of the other companies in our peer group. And certainly here in the UK, the wealth managers here in the UK, I think that LGT have been doing work for so long, and that data collection point that you mentioned, that is pretty much the biggest challenge in sustainability in general, but particularly around looking to create targets and monitor on those targets. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to finish off with a final question. What are the future plans to target environmental issues such as climate change with LGT? We've achieved quite a lot so far, but what are we looking at in the future?
Yeah, as I already said, we want to become net zero by 2030 on the operations side. So that is not so easy as it seems to be. And on the investment side, we said latest by 2050, trying to do that earlier, but this is even more complicated. So we're starting off really to gather the data on around all that. So we will as well start to report on our climate-related financial risks, which we haven't done yet because we have more focused on the positive side. So what can we do? How can we contribute to climate protection? But as you know from TCFD, it's also a regulatory requirement that will come in Europe at least. And then I think also on a global scale that we have to report on the climate-related financial risks. And that's also because we want to become net zero, is one of the reasons we're actively engaging in different organizations and also in one starting from this year to develop a standard on how to measure financed emissions, because what we see is that lots of time we compare apples with pears and not apples with apples. And so I think we really need to have a standard, a common standard being used worldwide. So we try to contribute there. And I think this is really a topic that will keep us quite busy this year.
Yeah, and I think we've got a lot to look forward to, and a lot of really positive lessons have been learned over the last 12 months. I know here in London, our paper consumption, for example, has gone down by 98.9%, which is obviously phenomenal. And now we're on a big digitalization drive. And so hopefully we can learn lessons around carbon emissions and paper consumption into 2021 and beyond.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Great, thank you so much, Ursula. It's been really interesting. I think that all of us on the call are starting to build up a pretty comprehensive picture now of what businesses can do within their operations and strategy. Ursula, I'll come back to you in the Q&A session later, if that's okay. Thank you. I want to bring in Ted Franks now. Ted, you've been running the Web Sustainability Fund since it was launched 11 years ago. The Web Fund is an investment strategy that looks to allocate capital to the companies that are providing solutions to the opportunities that exist, like climate change and the challenges that exist, and those disruptive companies that Paul was talking about earlier on. Can I ask you to talk about how you do this, how you identify opportunities for investment, and give us some examples of companies that you're particularly excited about?
Yes, absolutely, Phoebe. And yes, thanks everyone for listening. And I'm afraid, I hope you can see the slides here. I'm the only one of our panelists who needs to rely on slides, so forgive me for that. I've also got the only one with a headset, but that's to screen the kids out, so it's probably for everyone's benefit. Right, I'll try and sort of counter through a bit of this. How do we play our part in solving climate change? So the first thing to say, so Web, I'm a partner, one of the founders, I'm the fund manager. We're a little dedicated boutique. Sustainability is all we do. We've had a strategy that's actually been going 15 years. As Phoebe says, it's been in this fund for 11 years. The key thing that always defined what we do is this idea of impact. And this slide, this is kind of our core slide, and it speaks very much to what Paul was talking about. We invest in the companies on the right-hand side of this slide. They're providing sustainable growth because they're solutions providers to the challenges of sustainability, of which climate change is obviously the largest one. Examples: Aptiv, making components for electric cars. Arcadis is a consulting engineer. Everything it does is around adaptation to climate change. And TPI Composites, which makes the blades for wind turbines. Now, if you look at this slide, over on the left, the business is at risk. I 100% agree with Paul, and we can talk about it later. It's very, very difficult for incumbent businesses to shift, and for the fossil fuel companies to do that, I would say, is virtually impossible. In the middle of this, the large majority of the market is companies which have what is effectively a neutral product, which doesn't have a climate change footprint or a solution, isn't a solution on its own. And those companies have to transition. And there's a big investment piece here, and this is really what's called ESG investing. But we're over on the right-hand side because we want those companies which are just providing solutions. We want pure play companies. They're often disruptive, as Paul mentioned. Sometimes they're just a good idea that the world just needs more of that's been around before. And then talking about, how we play our part. Well, these companies have been playing their part for a long time because the expense, kind of exactly again, it's referencing Paul again and again, but these companies, the challenges have been there for a long time. This is a good chart from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is the number of billion-dollar storms in the US. It goes up and up every year. The costs are there, the costs are real. And there's a market imperative to provide these solutions. But even more than that, and again, maybe here I don't disagree with Paul, but we go in a slightly different direction. In the last half of last year, 2020, we saw an unprecedented change in global policy backdrop towards climate change, and these big national net zero carbon commitments. And so now there's an even further imperative coming from a political level. I don't want to get over excited about it because, of course, politics is always too slow, but at least there is more now than there has been at any other point in the 15 years history of the strategy. And perhaps to represent this wonderful NGO Climate Action Tracker, they have this thermometer idea. Look at the yellow lines. Sort of a year and a bit ago, they were saying under an optimistic scenario, we might be talking about 2.8 degrees by the end of the century. They're now saying if these commitments are real, we can at least try and bend the curve. I'm afraid I'm in the camp that thinks it's probably going to be too little too late, but at least the opportunity is there. So now really to the question of how do we play our part? Well, we play our part as investors. You guys play your part as investors in trusting your capital to us. We think part of it has to be investing in the solutions providers. And to get to those net zero carbon targets, there are some very clear areas where there's going to have to be big investments. And this is kind of an overview. What we tend to invest in, as you'll see, because where the action of the solution is tends to be one step removed from the consumer. Most of our companies are kind of in the value chain. All these different areas, equipment, buildings, logistics, they all need to decarbonize. The companies that we think your capital should be in are the ones which are providing those solutions. So more examples, a trite one. If you think about the sort of the pie chart of where emissions come from, the largest group is energy. It's a slightly difficult area to invest in. We think wind is a more investable space than solar, but all these renewable technologies have delivered this incredible reduction in the cost of their energy. You can see that yellow line, the cost of turbines from Vestas, one of our investee companies, at the same time as being profitable. And it's these guys decarbonizing energy that have even given us kind of even a shot of getting somewhere towards bending that carbon curve. And so obviously that's a big area of investment for us. Second big pie piece in terms of carbon emissions, decarbonizing transport. The lines here are from the UK. We've got this good data. I love this chart. You know, look at UK consumers now taking this into their own hands. That's the green lines, battery electrics and hybrids. The big part of that is battery electrics. The grey lines, the fossil fuels, are coming down faster than everyone imagined. And even the yellow line, which is the kind of apology for fossil fuel cars, which is kind of the mild hybrid versions, they can't get any traction because people want electric now. We've got lots of companies in the fund which are making it possible to do that. And again, to Paul's point, we like the companies where they're really facing forward to the EV side and not having to grapple with the legacy ICE businesses, and that's what we look for. Industry, a next big pie piece, quite a tricky area to decarbonize. Good because you've got a very strong profit motive in it. Tricky because it's just actually technologically tricky. We've got a decent part of the portfolio doing this. Keyence on the left-hand side does machine vision. That helps you make your factory more efficient. Kion and Daifuku are in sort of decarbonizing logistics. Kind of very much incremental gains here. These aren't companies with big breakthroughs, but it all counts. We need to move industry down that curve as well. In a funny way, the big one is the next one, even though as you go around the pie, it's a smaller piece now, but food is a real challenge because whereas the other ones have technological pathways, food doesn't really yet. This is a company, again, I keep referring back to Paul, but he's worked with DSM. I'm glad he has. We love DSM. We've owned them for a long time. They're a chemicals company with a genuine passion for impact and sustainability. It feeds through everything they do. One of the products they've got is this food additive for cows, Bova. You feed it to your cows, it reduces the amount of methane they belch out. We need to eat less meat in general. In the meantime, this is part of the transition to try and get just some of that, more of that carbon out of that value chain. And then lastly, buildings, and buildings is a really, lastly for today, buildings is a really chewy one. You can see the green line here. So far, getting carbon out of buildings has really had no traction, and it's such a big piece of the pie as well. You see the dotted line. We need to really improve what we're doing with buildings. Tricky because a lot of buildings are already in place. You know, you need to have high property values to retrofit them, but we have investments which are helping people to do that. Lennox and Daikin, makers of the most efficient heating and cooling, another big chunk of carbon to go for there. So this is where your capital should be, we think, in the pure play solutions providers, disrupt and non-disrupt, on what we think we have to do as asset owners, because we're representing you with your capital. So the first thing to say is, obviously, of course, we've got to make our own commitments. And even if our companies are providing solutions, they need to decarbonize themselves. We are very pleased to be in the vanguard of this. We're part of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative with our 1.2 billion sterling alongside Fidelity with its whatever it is, $1 trillion or whatever. But we're very pleased to be part of it. The green bar here is our own footprint. I don't need to talk about that too much because it's a pretty small thing, really. We're a small organization. You know, we fly around a bit, but we can offset that and try and cut that down, use Zoom, that sort of thing. the bigger thing is down at the bottom here, the blue lines. It's our portfolio we need to take responsibility for. We need to have a plan for decarbonising it. And that doesn't mean just selling all of our industrial companies, many of whom are really making the difference, and buying a bunch of software companies that have low carbon footprints anyway, right? What we're about is making sure we've got the solutions providers and making sure they're doing the right thing. We've got these clear commitments. Again, you'd say maybe they should be even stronger, but we've got to get the companies to commit by 2025. We've got to see real results by 2030. And of course, the way we're going to do that is by being active owners. This is the most horrible slide you've ever seen. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better way to do it. The table is taken from our quarterly engagement report. It's available online. You can see everything we do. What I'm trying to highlight here is in any given quarter, we have a number of engagements. We've had quarters where we've done specifically around carbon. But in this, which was kind of a standard quarter, about half of our engagements have a carbon theme to them. And you can bet between now and 2025, that's all we're going to be talking to our companies about. It's like, where are you on these commitments? What are you really doing? And not kind of relative the whole time. Let's try and get it absolute as well. A couple more quick slides from me as I've kind of rushed through this to give us a bit of time for questions. And I always welcome questions in slower time if you want as well. But another aspect to this, how can we play our part? We do think it's very important that investors have a long-term horizon for this. You need to be a long-term investor to support these companies doing the good things that they're doing. That helps reduce their cost of capital, and it helps you build a relationship with them where you can influence them. The blue bars are our turnover implied holding period, and that's probably even a bit understated. The dark blue and the green is the market. So we think this is only really for people who are prepared to take a risk with their capital over the long term. And then the very last slide, well, the second to very last slide for me, the last slide I'm going to talk to, is there is this very important connection too, that we as custodians of your capital are very transparent and very clear to you about where we're investing. We've talked a bit about it today. We've talked about all the things we do in engagement. We have a website which is completely transparent. You can see everything we invest in, why we invest in it. We have this methodology which we've been using for a few years now, and we're constantly improving, which we call the impact map, which helps investors understand why we think companies are doing a good thing and to what extent they're doing it in a high quality way. And you can go in there and you can read and understand really what our view is of why these companies are solution providers. And if you don't have that feeling as the owner of the capital, then your ability to say you're playing a part is obviously reduced. And we think it's absolutely critical that the financial system acts as a proper conduit of people's intentions rather than kind of an obfuscation or a screen. I feel like I've absolutely galloped through that. I'm sorry, but hopefully you've got some time for questions. I'll close. Here's our financial performance, which we also obviously talk about. And I think now I'll probably close up, and I think we go to questions next.
Thanks so much, Ted. Always such an engaging discussion from you and set of charts. I certainly was screenshotting some on my phone.
Good.
We'll do some more questions on that later. If we welcome back Ursula and Paul, we've got some interesting questions come through from those on the line. Please do just keep putting them through onto the chat. I'm going to start with one, which probably is best answered by you, Ted. You've used this phrase net zero. I mean, we all have used this phrase net zero a few times in the presentation today. Just for those on the line that aren't so familiar, what does net zero actually mean? Yeah, so net zero is when your operations are effectively not producing any excess carbon emissions. And the reason it's net is that gross, of course, is really what matters, which is what are you actually producing? And that's where the energy has to be to try and reduce that. And the bits that you fundamentally cannot, and obviously there's always a question about what cannot means, because there are people already who will catch a bus from Australia or would have caught a boat from Australia to the UK rather than flown. But at some point you sort of have to accept there's probably nothing you can do. And only at that point do you go into offset. So you're going to offset even bit of carbon that you produce is good, and that's what a net zero carbon commitment is. But I should just, otherwise, there are now calculations coming out. There isn't space for all the forest you need to offset the carbon. And also, there's a feeling about offsetting, isn't there? We're just pushing the problem down the road onto another country, into another country or another set of people. So it's also about addressing the issue right here, right now, rather than just offsetting it by building a forest or planting a forest. Yes, that's right. Ted's having a few problems with his Wi-Fi, just for those on the line. I agree with that. Sorry,
I'm
Ted.
sorry, can you hear me? I've turned the camera off to hopefully help.
Yeah, that's better. Go on.
Is that better? Just very quickly, you're dead right. You're dead right. You know, you've got to take responsibility for your own emissions. You've got to get them down. It's just it's a core principle, really.
Great. There's a question I'm going to start with Paul here. There seems to be a real shift here in the mindset towards sustainability since the first lockdown. And over the last 12 months, there's a real pickup in interest and awareness. What do you think's triggered this?
Look, I think there's a couple of things. One is that people recognise that the big macro disruptive risks actually happen, right? So once you've seen COVID happen, you kind of think, okay, God, what else is out there? And of course, climate change is the biggest one by far in terms of potential economic impact and geopolitical impact. So I think that's part of it. The second part, though, I think, is that we can act. Is that people are very disempowered by climate change. They think it's a scary issue. It's the end of the world. It's like, you know, all of which is kind of true in a way, but if we get it wrong. But the point is that's disempowering. Whereas when we see how much change we can drive when we choose to act, and when we choose to act driven by the science, but we go, oh, actually, we could do a lot of stuff in this area. And in actual fact, given we're most likely to leave it until the crisis becomes a real crisis on climate change, when we do act, it's likely to be disruptive, dramatic, and very significantly economic. And that to me is a really important idea. So I think COVID's sort of been a teacher, if you like, of a number of issues, those two, but also that we operate in a complex, interconnected global system. And those things in combination, I think, has led to a very significant awakening of issues like climate and sustainability more broadly. And of course, there are a whole bunch of actual technical issues about, you know, whether the virus, you know, those sort of viruses are more likely to emerge in a world where we've constrained nature to very, you know, very restricted areas. You know, that also becomes an issue. So I think there's a combination of things.
Ted, Ursula, any further points to add on that one? The triggers around why sustainability has become so important to all of us?
I think Paul absolutely nailed it. I mean, that's, you know, the change in mindset. It's an acceleration of issues that we have to deal with. It's, as he said, at its source, it's got this biodiversity issue with these zootropic things coming through, and it's I mean, it's so miserable now in lockdown in London, and sort of with no sort of view into the future. But if this is this, forgive my language, if this is the slap in the face that we needed, or at least one of the slaps in the face we needed, you know, in a way you might look back and say, gosh, thanks for the pandemic, which is a remarkable thing to say, but possible.
We have had a few questions come in about hydrogen. So hydrogen, is this a potential challenge to electric, I'm going to say electric vehicles rather than electric cars, because I know there's a bit of a dichotomy between the different size of vehicles. Is hydrogen a reality? Any thoughts on that? I'm going to start with you, Ted.
Okay, so hydrogen is, first and foremost, the hype at the moment is absolutely people in the oil and gas industry scrambling to respond to this. That's why you can see, you know, there's a point where there was no broker who covered the oil and gas sector who didn't want to talk to me about hydrogen last year. So that's the sort of first thing. But I would say I welcome it, right? If people want to put their energy into it. And we have seen that people can move us down the technology curve way faster than anyone thinks if they just put their mind to it. Tesla's a great example that Paul made. So I absolutely welcome it. There are certainly applications where it should be stronger. I mean, at the moment, honestly, the approach is whatever we can throw at this, you know, let's do it. And clearly the technological possibilities there are very great. I'll pass to Paul if it's before I sort of ramble on anymore. How do you see it, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's, you know, whatever works. And if whoever wants to invest should invest in those areas. And as you say, the oil and gas industry has a self-interest in that sort of structure versus the more diversified, distributed, democratized energy sources. But there's fundamentally an elegance to making and storing your own power and controlling your own destiny. And that's, as a consumer, that is incredibly appealing, right? So one of the big drivers of solar and batteries here in Australia, for example, is not climate change or even cost. It's sticking up the big guys. You know, it's like, I want to control my energy system. And that's emotionally very appealing to people, right? Now, in the end, price trumps everything else. But ultimately, I think all these things drive technology transformation, and I do think there is a sense where there is a great democratization of energy and transport inherent in renewables, batteries, and those related technologies around transport. And what I mean by that is if you're in Africa, right, and you've got to build a massive multi-billion-dollar piece of infrastructure to get power, right, that's a lot less appealing than putting a battery and a light bulb in your hut. Right? Now, of course, we need big industrialized, centralized power in some situations or certain applications, but there is an inherent benefit to distributed systems. And that's an economic question, right? Because it means is that you can drive change faster. Now, of course, big oil and gas wants to have big oil and gas / hydrogen facilities because it suits their business model. I don't object to that. I just think that you have to look at the economics of it. And that's why nuclear will also fail, right? Is because big and expensive and slow will always be beaten, right, by fast and small and technology friendly.
There's a few questions that have come in here about fossil fuel companies. I'm going to try and wrap a few together. So one is about the oil companies funding anti-climate change science. Do you think they've given this up? And the question here, or the person sending the question says that they don't think they'll go down fighting or greenwashing. So oil companies and their funding of anti-climate change science. And then I'm going to wrap in another one, which is, do you think the impact of Biden's call to end federal subsidies for fossil fuels will be, what will the impact be? And how likely is it to gain traction?
Let me jump into this one. This is very much my issue. I've written lots about this on my website, paulgilding.com, if you want to look into it in more detail. But fundamentally, there is an incredible driver in the global system against fossil fuels now, right? And it's economic, and it's price competitiveness, and it's loss of political power. All those things are really super important because these companies, many of whom I know and like people who work there, and there's not a kind of moral right, wrong, evil guys kind of issue for me, but they've just lost it. They've lost their power and their influence in a dramatic way in just the last 3 or 4 years. And the prime reason is they're no longer central to our economic success. In fact, they're an impediment to our economic success. What that means is that, yeah, losing subsidies is a really important issue. What it means is when they go and lobby now and say, we want these policies to protect us and the economy, many politicians are saying, well, I'm not sure it's actually good for the economy for me to protect you anymore, right? And no amount of influence and lobbying and power overcomes a threat to a politician's vote, right? So that is a really super big change, I think. Now, the question is, right, of course they're going to fight to the death, right? And the Exxons and Chevrons, a bunch of them will do so, but the Totals and the BPs, etc., have given up the ghost and said, okay, we've lost, right? It's time to move on before we get chewed up in the process. And so it's not like the fossil fuel industry versus the rest, right? It is a market. And there are some companies who are choosing to be on the side of change. I don't think they'll succeed, but good luck to them. Some of them will, right? And there are companies that are going to fight to the death to protect what they have left, right? And if you're an investor, that's a pretty simple equation. Do you back the loser on the way down, hoping to get a few more bucks out of the process? Good luck in that process. Or do you assume the transition is now underway?
Thank you very much, Paul. Ursula, there's a question here for you. It's all about the importance of investing as part of the solution here. Really, there's only so much that politics can do. There's only so much that philanthropic capital can do. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know that LGT have been looking at joining various organisations to really back our vision of that.
Yes, I think philanthropy should really play a big role as well, and can play an important role here as well. So what we see is also with our we have a department, it's called Venture Philanthropy, and they are also looking into solutions for climate protection, especially in Africa, but also in India. So really in the most vulnerable regions, I would say. It's like, I'm not quite sure if Paul said it's that offsetting is just not really being the solution, and I think so as well. But it's a good start. I think it had its reason, but I think we have to move on. And so I'm very happy that with Venture Philanthropy we can really also contribute to in the most vulnerable regions to climate protection and help these communities there.
Yeah, and in terms of the finance industry coming together, there are various initiatives, aren't there, that can also help outside of philanthropy in order to really focus within the companies, focus companies' attention and collaboratively work towards some of these bigger goals. Can you talk about that with regards to LGT? Yeah, I mean, we're a member of several organizations. So we're, for example, a member of the CO Climate Leaders Alliance of the World Economic Forum. So I think this is an important membership, but what the newest membership, I think, which will really drive the banking industry, is the Principles for Responsible Banking. So we also decided to sign these principles because they really have as an objective to transform to a more sustainable banking industry in a whole. So I think this is really something that is very important, and to serve and to intend to serve to a framework also for achieving the Paris Climate Agreement. Yeah. So I think this is really are important organizations or important initiatives we see, and really also actively working in these kind of initiatives to contribute to achieving the Paris Agreement, and in that regard also to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. I think we've got time for one more question. And there's an interesting question here about the geographic dynamics that are going on. There's an interesting dynamic between the two economic superpowers, China and the US, who have been at loggerheads with one another for the past 4 years and previously, and are now both vying for the #1 spot for renewable energy investment and development. How do you see this playing out? I'm going to go across to Ted, please.
Well, I mean, the first couple of things to say. Obviously, very good that significant political blocs are engaged with this. Obviously, the US very late to the table. We've had a sort of 4-year hiatus, which has been, deeply regrettable. May in the end have been, you hate to say it, could be the thing that costs the planet the success in this. Instinctively, I would say, and kind of I presume Paul would agree, the free market, fresh ideas, innovative capitalist approach I would back over the Chinese approach. I would say as well, if you're talking about sustainability, I don't think you can really ignore some of the pretty significant kind of human rights and other issues that are coming with China's rise. And I think you've got to be very careful about embracing them because they're green. I think that's a very interesting thing to try to do. I mean, I think the way it plays out is what we've seen before, the innovation. And I mean, the Americans have got this huge cost of capital advantage. They'll bring bright new ideas and they'll put a lot of money behind them, and they will probably save us. And then the Chinese will watch it, copy it, and make it cheaper and help us on that part of spreading it out. There you go. That's my answer. It's probably slightly above my pay grade. I'll see what Paul makes of it.
But China today is investing double what the US is.
Well, it is. I mean, you've got to, obviously with these numbers, you've got to pass that back. It's investing, what you see there is the investment through the centralized system and the big numbers of it. Actually, the real comparator is what capital is moving. Of course, the US is moving the private market capital, right? The two big sources of capital in the world right now, US capital markets, which have gone nuts after 20 years of low interest rates. The only reason Tesla actually achieved what it did is because its cost of capital is nothing. There's just a huge amount of money there, pumping that valuation up, giving Elon all the freedom he needs. It's, for a European company, looking at that's a dream. It's a dream to have that. The other big cost of capital source is the Chinese Communist Party, because they direct all this capital. And so great that both bunches of capital are pointing in this direction. I should stop and because Paul, this is Paul's thing, not mine. Paul, what do you make of it?
No, I think your comments are really good, Ted, and spot on. The only thing I would add to it, and it really is adding to it, is that this reinforces the argument that this is now an economic geopolitical point of differentiation, right? Is that you have China saying we want to build the ecological civilization, not because they care about ecology, but because they want to dominate that part of the economy, right? And they see the opportunity inherent in that. The US is behind for political reasons, but way ahead, as Ted said, in terms of cost of capital, innovation, and freedom to move and so on. So those two things come together. So when you see those two blocks competing, they're not competing for moral leadership, right? They're competing for economic dominance. And Tom Friedman's written a lot about this in the New York Times, that this is the inherent benefits of the US system, the ones that Ted's outlined, should give it an enormous advantage. And that's why the Biden presidency could be so important for driving that process. But you look back at, say, the German feed-in tariffs, many years ago now, drove massive solar production of panels in China, right? It wasn't the intention. The intention was to drive it in Germany, but China produced the panels. That dramatically dropped the price of solar and drove the solar boom globally. Now, it wasn't, it's a classic example of policy achieving its objective in an unintended way, right? But that is huge because China can produce things more cheaply. So Ted's analysis, America will invent, China will copy, drive the cost down, it'll spread, is the system that I think we'll see. But of course, there is more to the world, as you may be aware, than China and the US, right? And that there are many other blocks of power and economic opportunity that are also going to drive this process very strongly. So I would not, take my eyes off India, for example, as a major place to see big change coming. Likewise, of course, the European Union and that little thing to the side of it, both could play a significant role in this process.
Great, thank you so much. We're very much coming up to the end of the hour here, so I'm going to wrap up discussion there. Thank you so much to all of the contributors today, and thank you so much for the questions that have come through. I opened up this webinar with Mark Carney's description of climate change. I hope this webinar has helped illustrate that actually mobilising private finance is an absolutely essential part of tackling climate change, but it also represents, from an investment perspective, a really important opportunity for us to all play our part and to finance a more sustainable future. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Paul, for coming and dialing in from Tasmania. Thank you to Ursula and to Frank, to Ted. And very soon. Sorry, Frank. Thank you all.
That happens all the time. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Cheers.